All right, let's look at Matthew's genealogy. So we are looking at the first verses of Matthew, Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17. Matthew begins his gospel with Jesus's genealogy. So Mark Strauss, in his book, Four Portraits, One Jesus, says this: Matthew begins with a genealogy tracing the royal ancestry of Jesus. From Matthew's Jewish perspective, Jesus' genealogy is profoundly important, confirming his legitimacy as the promised Savior and King who will bring Israel's history to its climax. The narrator identifies Jesus as the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and he traces his ancestry from Abraham through David all the way down to Joseph and Mary. So Matthew's genealogy is interesting. It's very important. Let's take a look at it first, okay? So first thing we notice about Matthew's genealogy is the structure of it. Matthew loves structure, and the genealogy is no exception. He structures his genealogy into 3 groups of 14 names in each group. So group 1 of Matthew's genealogy goes from Abraham up to David. The second group goes from David to the exile, and group 3 from the exile to Christ. Now, these are 3 groups of 14 names that each start and stop with a key person or a key event in the history of Israel. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But what's interesting is that the number 14 might have a significance as well, because this number could have a connection to the numerical value of the Hebrew name of David. So this is a picture that came out of Mark Strauss's book, Four Portraits, One Jesus, and it's got the Hebrew letter with their numerical equivalent. And we can see how the name of David numerically actually adds up to the number 14, which I'm no Hebrew expert, but that's kind of an interesting clue as to possibly why Matthew organized his genealogy in these ways, possibly based on the numerical value of the name of David. But either way, let's now look at Matthew's genealogy. So in the previous module, we had looked at John's genealogy, and now we want to slide all the way down here in the harmony of the Gospels. And we can see right now we have our first comparison where we have these 2 genealogies next to one another. So what we want to see here is, importantly, look at how Matthew starts his genealogy. Matthew 1:1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He does not want his reader to miss that Jesus is directly connected to these 2 very important Jewish heroes of the Old Testament, David and Abraham. So, knowing that, let's begin to read through Matthew's genealogy. Verse 1, so the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. To Abraham was born Isaac, to Isaac was born Jacob, Jacob to Judah were born Perez and Zerah and Tamar. To Perez was born Hezron. There's nothing more boring than listening to somebody read a genealogy, by the way. But let's get down to the end of this one. Right? It goes down to Hezron, to Ram, verse 4. Ram was born down to Abinadab, blah, 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 blah. So let's pretend that I just read all of those, okay? I'm going to spare you from reading the rest of the genealogies. The point is how they begin and how they end. So let's look at this first group. It goes from Abraham down to David. So from here, you can see this first group clearly right there. It goes to Jesse and was born King David. Now, King David is going to start the next section as well. But we have here, you'll notice it starts with Abraham and it goes to David. And you've got these 14 names, or these 12 names in between these 2. I like Strauss's quote on this, where he says, since some of the names are known to be missing from Matthew's genealogy, it's clear that Matthew has intentionally shortened or telescoped the list. This was a common practice in Jewish genealogies, and it was intended to develop a memorable structure or to emphasize certain individuals. Interesting. Okay. Now, the question, though, that comes about is, why would Matthew structure his genealogy around David and around the exile? So it starts with Abraham, but then in the middle there's David, and at the end there is the exile. Well, here's a couple reasons. The Old Testament prophets viewed the exile as God's punishment for Israel's rebellion. They did not keep their end of the covenant, and that was the exile was the punishment for that. Also, since the exile, no king from David's line had reigned in Israel. As we look at Luke's genealogy, we're going to talk about how significant the line of David is to the connection to Jesus. But for the moment, what we realize is that Matthew felt like many of the Jews in Jesus' day, even then under Rome, felt like they were still in exile under Roman rule, and they were still awaiting a Messiah from the line of David. So what's cool about Matthew's genealogy and the way that he structures it this way is that when he announces this genealogy, he announces that hope has returned, that a king from the line of David has come to save the people from their sins. So to Matthew's Jewish audience, remember, his gospel is that Jesus is the Messiah. He starts with the genealogy because this genealogy must have been thrilling, and it proved that God was faithful to his promises. So important to realize that this structure of this genealogy leads toward Matthew's fulfilling of his purpose of showing that Jesus is truly the Jewish Messiah. So that's that first group right there. Let's slide down to the second group. Now, this second group goes from King David all the way up to the exile. So if we look at it, starts right there, starts with David, and it ends with Jeconiah, the last king of Judah, right before, really Jeconiah and his brothers, which were the kings right before the exile. And it goes through all of these Old Testament kings right there. Now, here on the page, it stops with Uzziah, but if we go slide over to the next page, you could see that the list right there continues with the remainder of, these were all kings of Judah after Judah and northern Israel split. But this led all the way up to the history of the exile, where the Jews were captured by King Nebuchadnezzar and taken into Babylon as prisoners. So that's that second group. If we slide down and we look at the third group right here, this group goes from verse 12 down to verse 17. So here we can see that it starts with the deportation into Babylon, Jeconiah, the last king of Judah, right there, and then everybody that fell in between Jeconiah and Jesus that he chose to include. Remember, Matthew intentionally left names out, designed to make the genealogy clear and memorable, but also structured. So that's a little bit on Matthew's genealogy right there. It's got three groups, and it's important to realize that there's a couple other things that are very interesting about Matthew and his genealogy that is not typical for other genealogies. So here we have the structure. We've talked about each of those three groups, but there's a couple other cool things about Matthew's genealogy. For example, Matthew's genealogy is unusual in that it contains 5 women. This was highly unusual that women would be included in a genealogy, but Matthew's contains 5. It contains Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, which is what's called, who is, of course, Bathsheba, and Mary. Now, this is interesting because why did he do this? Well, maybe because these women represent the sinners and the outsiders that Jesus came to save. Of course, the women were never normally included in genealogies, as they were never normally included in a lot of things in this time period, whereas including them in the genealogy dignifies them and places them right alongside men as important parts, important components of what God is doing by sending this Jewish Messiah. So that's an interesting piece also about Matthew's genealogy. So that's a lot about Matthew's genealogy. So again, it begins with Abraham. It follows the legal or the royal line of Jesus through the line of Joseph, making sure that the reader knows that Jesus is both connected to Abraham as well as King David. And so now we want to shift over to looking at Luke's genealogy. So I want to compare them really quick, and then we're going to unpack Luke's genealogy a lot more in the next video. So Luke's genealogy is different than Matthew's genealogy in a couple of ways. First is that Luke goes all the way back to Adam. So Matthew starts with Abraham. Luke goes all the way back to Adam. Now let's do a little comparison here. So for Matthew, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So he begins his genealogy with Abraham so as to emphasize Jesus' Jewish heritage, which makes sense. Luke, though, his emphasis is that Jesus is the Savior of the world. That would also make sense that he goes back past Abraham all the way back to Adam to emphasize the universal salvation that this Messiah has come to offer. He's not just the Savior of the Jews, he's the Savior of the world. So this now sets us up to take a deeper look into Luke's genealogy. So let's do that in our next video. So in our next lesson, what we want to do is we want to now shift from Matthew's genealogy to looking at Luke's genealogy, where Luke unpacks Jesus' natural lineage through Mary.